It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Shri Dandotkar. Dr. Dandotkar is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Southern Indiana. He was born in India, where he received his bachelor's degree in medicine before he moved to the US to start a new career in cognitive psychology. He earned a master's degree and a PhD in cognitive psychology from Northern Illinois University. He joined USI Family in 2016, and since then, he has been teaching cognitive psychology, data literacy, and the research methods and statistics courses. In 2017, he received the Volunteer USI Mentor of the Year Award. And his research interests include text comprehension, argumentation, and knowledge representation. Dr. Shri Dandotkar lives in Evansville with his wife, Dee, his daughter, Nirvana, and his pet, Minnie. Today, Dr. Dandotkar is presenting on improving students' argumentation skills, what, how, and why.
Okay, hi everyone. I know I can't see you guys. I'll just have to imagine you guys. So the topic is improving students' argumentation skills, what, why, and how. So when I say argumentation skills, I'm specifically referring to skills pertinent to comprehending arguments, evaluating arguments, and producing arguments. Although I'll be focusing more on the evaluation of arguments today. And we'll talk about what evaluation of arguments is, why it is important to address, and how we can improve students' argumentation skills specific to evaluating arguments. Now, having said that, the question of why, I can post several of these. I try to find funniest, but you can clearly see lack of several things, but also lack of evaluation skills in the person who write it. I'm not saying anything else. I'm just saying that these lack logical argumentation. So, well, this is not this could be one reason why this is an important topic to discuss, but in our study, we found that when students are presented with arguments of this sort, like people should not be allowed to have more than 2 biological children because children are small, we found that only 65% of college students are accurate in evaluating arguments of this sort. And yet we know that these evaluative skills are important to succeed in college. In fact, high school students are expected to have learned these skills before they go to college. But we know from several sources, including National Assessment of Education Progress and whatnot, and this is not the latest, we have the latest one, which is not reported here, but suggests that most of the high school graduates lack the skill to evaluate arguments. And when I say arguments, several things come to our mind. I'm specifically focusing on arguments of a specific kind called informal arguments, based on Tolman's model of argument, and we'll talk about that in a second. So this is one reason why it is important to find ways to improve students' evaluation skills, and that's what we're going to talk about. Now, before we move on to what these informal arguments are and what are the factors I've identified so far, and specifically talking about 2 studies today, I'm going to give you a very brief understanding of a construct in text comprehension. That's what my basic research, fundamental research is in. And that will lay foundation to the studies I'll talk about later on. So according to theories of text comprehension, when we read something, when we read a text, we kind of develop a representation of what we read in our mind. In a sense, we are kind of extracting meaning from what we are reading, and we represent the meaning at 3 different levels. At the same time, the basic level is the surface form, which retains the exact word, the syntactic structure of whatever you have read, that sentence, and also the meaning conveyed in it, but it is quickly lost. The next level of representation is the meaning level representation. It's called text-based, where it only stores the gist of the information that is being read. The third one is a situation model representation, which holds only some syntactic elements, but mostly these are inferences and elaborations that one as a reader would develop when reading something. For instance, you're reading a story and it talks about, say, a Christmas, then that may evoke your memories of Christmas tree, your grandparents, whatnot. So your referential, in other words, your situation model representation of whatever you're reading right now incorporates all this information. In other words, and this information is what is retained for a longer time. That's why when we read something, when you're asked, like, what did you read? You won't be able to recall the exact sentences because the surface form of the information is lost. We may be able to represent some gist of it, but most of what we remember is the deeper connections we have made when we read this text. Now, this is about text, but arguments are also a form of text, and that's what we're going to talk about. So keeping this in mind, when we say I'm interested in arguments, I'm talking about informal arguments based on Tolman's model. Uh, a simple argument has two elements to it. Again, there are several elements. I'm not going into detail, but these elements are important for our purpose of today's discussion. A simple informal argument would have a claim and a reason. For instance, in this case, there is death penalty should be abolished is the claim. And it is supported with the reason that because it is immoral. Now, when one evaluates informal arguments of this type, first, you need to determine if the reason is true. And then you need to make a connection between the reason and claim and see if the reason is relevant to the claim. And is the provided reason sufficient, at least minimally, to support the claim? That's how you evaluate arguments according to Blair and Johnson, 1987. Now, of course, in the context of a bigger argument, there are other elements. Like there is backing, there is counter arguments, there is rebuttal, there are other sorts of things. But today we are just focusing on the claim and reason aspect of it. Now, within the claim, we have identified another specific aspect of it, which is called the predicate. Predicate is that main verb or verb phrase in a sentence in a claim. Like in the, for instance, argument one here, the claim is that death penalty should be abolished, and the predicate is the main verb, which is should be abolished. In the second case, it is ineffective. Now, if you read these two arguments, death penalty should be abolished because it is immoral, death penalty should be ineffective because it is immoral, well, definitely one is a relevant claim, a relevant reason to the claim, whereas the other one is not. For instance, you can say that death penalty should be abolished because it is immoral. The reason is relevant and may be sufficient minimally to make this claim an okay claim. Whereas death penalty is ineffective because it's immoral may not be, at least in the way it is presented in two clauses, be understood as a good argument. Now, the problem here I'm trying to focus on is the idea that predicate. And from what we have read from the previous slide, that when you read something, you develop these representations. One of those representations is the surface form verbatim representation, right? And so if you retain a verbatim representation of a predicate versus if you don't retain a verbatim representation of predicate, what will happen? Well, we found, for instance, if someone represents the claim of death penalty should be abolished and death penalty is ineffective, both as something bad, right? Then both these may seem good reasons to support that claim. In order to effectively evaluate this argument, then one need to actually have a precise representation of it. Only when you have a precise representation of whether it should be abolished or is ineffective, can you see the relevance or irrelevance of the reason to the claim. Okay, so this is some background about arguments and the predicate. We'll be using this term, so I thought I'll talk about that. Okay, so now we looked at what argumentation is in general. We looked at why we should study it or why I'm interested in it. Now let's move on to how we can improve or how we can help students be better argumentators, if that's a word, or argument evaluators. Now, in my research, I looked at several factors related to understanding what makes a good argument evaluator, especially in students. Those factors are related to text, context in which they are reading those arguments, and factors related to students themselves. And I'm going to talk briefly about these factors and what we have found so far in the research. But I'll focus mostly on one of these factors, the student-related factors. And of those, there is one important factor about students' beliefs, and that's what we'll focus on. So, so this is like a gist of what we looked at so far in my research, and there are student-related factors, text-related factors, context-related factors, and there are some interventions also we looked at. Now, coming to student-related factors, as we discussed earlier, we said that it makes sense to assume that those who represent the precise predicate would be able to retain the claim better and be able to make evaluations better by connecting the claim to the reason, right? That's exactly what we found in a study in 2008. We found that students who remember and retain the exact predicate were actually good at evaluating arguments. And we also found that um, good skilled readers or skilled readers tend to retain these predicates better than less skilled readers. And this is one particular finding that was replicated over and over again. So that's one important thing we can take into account to help students pay attention to the predicate. Now, there are other related factors like reading skill and attitudes. Let me talk about the attitudes here. I'll come back to the attitudes because before that, I need to talk about the textual factors. Now, what kind of textual factors are we talking about? Now, what we did in the textual factors is we try to see, well, there is a claim and there is a reason. Sometimes you encounter these anchors, I don't want to take names, but who make these claims about stuff not providing any logical reasons that would connect to the claim and make it relevant, rather just use some common words between claims and reasons that are totally irrelevant, like keep using the words over and over again and try to make an argument. Some people do get persuaded by that. So what I did in this study was try to see which kind of connections would people rely more on. So I took a claim and created 4 different versions of reasons for it. And half of the versions, the 2 versions were logically related to the claim. In other words, they were good arguments. And the other half were not logically related. Now, within each of these categories, one of the argument was very related in terms of words, so semantic related. So there are common words used in both reason and claim. Whereas in the other, there were no common words that were used. So what I found was that those who are skilled in reasoning, they were able to actually rely more on the logical connections. And even less skilled reasoners also relied on logical connections between claim and reason, but not as much as the reasoning skilled reasoners. That's one thing. The other thing is that the less skilled reasoners relied more on semantic connections. In other words, they try to evaluate arguments by seeing the word overlap between the claim and reasons, right? And especially for those arguments that were bad arguments. In other words, you can give a bad argument by just using some words common between claims and reasons. That is the point. Now, this is just the specifics are more. I don't think we have time to go over that, but one important thing in the same study I did, which was actually my dissertation, was have this exit survey. And in that exit survey, what I did was I asked participants some specific questions, like presented all these arguments again, and try to gather post hoc, gather their beliefs about these claims that they evaluated earlier. And when I run that analysis, and what I found was that when students believed in a claim, they tend to rely, let me rephrase it. Okay. between the reasoning, skilled reasoners and less skilled reasoners. Less skilled reasoners are twice or 2.5 times more likely to accept an argument that is not logical, but has high semantic content in it, but more so if it matches with their beliefs. So students' beliefs about the content they're reading does play a role in how they evaluate arguments. Well, I did not take it further because you need to create items of different beliefs and all that stuff. But there is another kind of belief or attitude that I'm more interested in, and that's what I'll talk about, which is the epistemic beliefs. I think we're doing good in terms of time, right, Erska? Okay, so we'll come to epistemic beliefs for a second. I'm just going to talk about other things, what we found in my research. In terms of the context itself, we found that the reason why someone is reading, the context in which someone is reading an argument also plays an important role. Like if they are asked to read an argument to whether or not you agree with it versus evaluate if it's a good argument, people tend to make different kind of decisions, and people tend to rely on these logical and semantic connections differently. That's one thing. And a recent thing is about writing prompts. When you ask students to write an argument, asking them to write it for those who have similar beliefs versus people who have different beliefs. So that prompt itself seemed to have some effect on how well they present other side information. Again, I'm going beyond the thing. I just wanted to throw some stuff there. We can discuss more later on if you have any questions. Related to that is the same study where we created an audience awareness tutorial and try to see if we can induce students to think about audience when they're writing arguments. Would that improve their argumentation, especially in terms of whether or not they will incorporate other side information? Like getting rid of my side bias, providing counter arguments, providing rebuttals. It seems like that audience seem to have some effect on that. Again, we're not talking about it, just wanted to kind of give a bigger picture of some things. Now, these interventions are specific to comprehension, not argumentation, so I'm not going to talk about that. I think we have I think we should stop at this point and move on to the main point here, epistemic beliefs. So we'll talk about two studies today that are related to this student-related factor and how that influences students' evaluation of arguments, and that's called epistemic beliefs. It used to be epistemological beliefs. It's like painful to say, so people cut it down. Even the literature, they are now calling it epistemic beliefs. Now, for my philosopher friends, the epistemic beliefs here is slightly different, and I'll talk about what it is in a second. We are not talking about epistemology in the sense of philosophy, but we're talking about people's beliefs about knowledge and learning. So this is what we'll do in the rest of the time we have here. First, we'll talk about what these epistemic beliefs are. Then we'll talk about the rationale for the two studies that we'll talk about, and then actually give some specifics of the study followed by its results, and then we'll open up for discussion. So what are epistemic beliefs? So epistemic beliefs are one's own beliefs about what knowledge is and how knowledge is acquired. So like as students, we think about students, and if they're taking a class, and what they think about how they learn, what they think about what constitutes knowledge, may be very important in determining whether or not and how they learn. That's what most of the research in educational psychology has looked at. How is people's beliefs about what knowledge is and how one can acquire knowledge would be related to how well they perform in school and college. What I'm interested in is trying to see how students' belief would be related to and whether that would be a good predictor of how well they evaluate arguments. And there are three different kinds of epistemic beliefs that educational researchers have looked at. One is domain general kind of epistemic beliefs. The other one is domain specific, and the third one is topic specific. Now, let me explain what is domain general. Domain general relates to one's beliefs about knowledge in general, or learning in general. Domain specific refers to knowledge in a specific field like science or mathematics or physics or whatever. Topic specific beliefs relate to one's beliefs about a specific topic of debate. For instance, um, global warming, and so forth. So in this one, I have two studies. In one study, I try to look at students' general beliefs about knowledge and learning and how that is related to argument evaluation. And the second study looked at domain-specific, science-specific beliefs and how that is related to one's argument evaluation. So most of the research in the domain general part comes from Schomer's um, uh, materials that he had produced. I used a shorter version of Schomer's items to actually conduct this study one. Now, these items will ask questions that would elicit students' beliefs about 5 aspects of knowledge and learning in general. That include speed of knowledge acquisition, and other things. Speed of knowledge acquisition refers to whether students believe whether they can acquire something quickly versus they believe that it's a slow, continuous process and effortful process. It takes time. So based on their scores and using this item, we can categorize students into falling into this category extremes of very sophisticated thinkers versus very novice thinkers in terms of what the speed of knowledge acquisition is. And those who think that it's a quick process, either you learn or don't learn in the first time, is more like an unsophisticated belief versus a sophisticated belief is that it's going to take time. You're going to do it again. It's an effortful process. The other beliefs that Schomer's list looked at is the structure of knowledge. An unsophisticated belief would be that knowledge is very simple, like a simple statement, versus a more sophisticated belief is that it is not simple, it is complex. And the other thing is about the knowledge construction and modification. A simpler view is that students are passive absorbers of information, but whatever my teacher says is the right thing. And so the source of your knowledge is the authority outside of you, as opposed to the idea that you construct the knowledge by taking information not from authority, but taking information from multiple sources. That would be a more sophisticated belief. Now, another belief is the meaningful of successful students. If students believe that, well, that is a smart kid, then that's seen as an unsophisticated belief versus, well, smartness is something that you can acquire. It's not born with or not thing. Then the objectivity, whether or not you can obtain objective truth. So these are the belief structures that Schomer looked at, and there are several publications on how the students' general epistemic beliefs like these is related to and predicts students' academic performance, both in the school and college levels. For instance, Schomer found that students who believe in quick learning, they write oversimplified summaries, and they scored low on comprehension test. Another example is those who believe that, knowledge is certain, right? They were less accurate in making inferences, or they made fewer inferences. So there's a lot of research on how these 5 factors predict, in general, students' academic performance. The more sophisticated beliefs they seem to have, the better they seem to do in terms of their school or college performance. So I'm gonna stop it there and then talk about the second kind of belief, the domain-specific belief. This is the one that I looked at in the second study. Now, the specific belief, the domain-specific beliefs that I looked at in this second study is related to one's beliefs about scientific knowledge. and especially related to one aspect of scientific knowledge, like how would you justify scientific knowledge? Like when you read something, how would you justify it? Now, by using Braden and Ferguson's material, there are three things that their items will capture, and they are justification by personal beliefs. In other words, if students are asked like, how do you justify what you learn in science indirectly though, they rely more on personal belief. So they think that something is true because it aligns with their personal beliefs. Versus some may rely on the authority, well, because my teacher said so, or that's what the book says. Or the third kind of belief is the justification by multiple sources or multiple documents, where students says that they justify what they learn not just by looking at one source, but actually look at the same information in a different source, maybe a different class, a different book, and different material, then form their own knowledge. So so far in this particular domain of research related to domain specific beliefs, what Braden et al., that's the closest I could find in terms of what is found on specific to college students, is those who relied on personal beliefs, like those who justified scientific things by personal beliefs, they tend to perform poorly in multiple document comprehension. This is multiple document comprehension. This is where we give them multiple documents to comprehend, and then they could write an argument by getting information from multiple sources. And it kind of makes sense that it is so. If they relied on personal beliefs, then their comprehension of these multiple documents is poor. And those who rely more on justification by multiple sources, they seem to actually do well in terms of comprehending information from multiple documents. Okay, so, okay, good so far? I think we have time, right? Okay, perfect. So coming to the rationale for the study. Well, from what we have looked at so far, it seems like students' general epistemic beliefs and domain-specific epistemic beliefs related to science are related to some sort of academic performance. But one kind of academic performance that is not looked at yet is the students' ability to evaluate arguments. And understanding that would give us new venues to help students, and that's what the reason or the rationale for these two studies that I'll talk about now. These two studies, the main objective of these two studies is to find if student epistemic beliefs are anyway good predictors of how well they evaluate arguments. And we did that in two different contexts. In study one, we looked at domain general beliefs, and in study two, we looked at domain specific beliefs. And in both the cases, try to see if it predicts their argument evaluation performance. So let's talk about study one now. So here, again, the purpose was to see if domain general epistemic beliefs related to how well one evaluate arguments. In this study, it had 127 undergraduate students. Then data from 12 participants were removed because of inconsistency in their responses or because they didn't complete it. Now, using the Qualtrics, this is what participants did. They took the flawed judgment task. This is a task that was first used in 18, and we continue to use it. It is a list of like 36 items, and based on how well they answer this, they get a score on it. And within these 36 items, so again, there are different kinds of items that are logical, and there are circular, and so on and so forth. The other thing is the general epistemic questionnaire, because we're interested in seeing how these 5 factors that we talked about would predict how well they evaluate arguments. So that's the other thing that was given. And at the end, because remember initially I said the one consistent thing I found was that those who retain the precise predicate, they're actually good at evaluating arguments. So at the end of the experiment, they were given surprise recall task from the same arguments that were given here, right? So they were given the topic and they were supposed to recall the entire argument in as close to the exact words as possible. Then we coded those for predicate and gave them scores in terms of how well they remembered the precise nature of the predicate. Okay. So I don't need to talk about, I just talked about fraud judgment task, the epistemic questionnaire. Again, you already know the epistemic questionnaire that I used, it has only 38 items, which is basically a modified version developed by Wood and Kardash based on Schomer's version. Anyways, so again, as we discussed, it captures 5 different beliefs about knowledge and learning in general. Okay, now at this point, if there are any students, you don't need to worry about it, but um, we need to run these, what do you say, principal component analysis to make sure these items that were given to participants in terms of the epistemic questionnaire are valid in terms of capturing the constructs that we think they do. So based on Ferguson et al. Recommendation, I ran the principal component analysis by using oblique rotation on these items, which resulted in 13 good items that met this criterion. I'm not going to read this. Further, I removed one item because it loaded on 2 factors significantly. So the final 12 items loaded well. What it means is that the final 12 items were so valid that they can explain the variation in the sample. Okay, then they were given the surprise recall task, right? Okay, now results. Okay, I deleted the hypothesis section, but results. So 3 ANCOVAs. Remember we had, let's see. So out of the 5 different measures, items specific to only these 3 measures came out well, meaning I could only capture students' speed of knowledge acquisition belief, and structure of knowledge belief, and beliefs related to construction and modification of knowledge. These were the only 3, what do you say, aspects of beliefs I was able to capture based on these 12 items that were good. So because there were only 3 beliefs, I ran 3 ANCOVAs, one for each kind of belief on the Flour judgment score, which is related to how well they evaluate arguments. Then the 2 levels of epistemic beliefs is to categorize them as those having unsophisticated beliefs and sophisticated beliefs. Then I also used the predicate recall score. Remember the surprise recall task? Try to kind of see whether whether this belief, high and low in these beliefs, will predict how will they evaluate arguments beyond one's ability to retain the precise nature of the predicate. Okay. Then there was main effect of only one belief out of these 3 beliefs, and that is speed of knowledge acquisition. Now, what it suggests is that a lower score is a refined belief and a higher score is an unrefined belief. As you can see, those who had less refined belief, they actually did poorly in terms of evaluating arguments, and those who had more refined beliefs, they seem to be evaluating arguments better. And that's about experiment 1. Okay. I know if it were live, I would have said any questions, but I'll proceed, I guess. Okay. Now, from these results, it seems like at least for at least specific to domain general beliefs about knowledge and learning, speed of knowledge acquisition seem to predict how will the valid argument. Well, if you think that you can learn something quickly, well, maybe you don't evaluate arguments better. How it is related, I have no idea, but it is related in the sense that if you hold less sophisticated beliefs, especially related to speed of knowledge acquisition, you seem to evaluate arguments poorly. Well, that led to look into another epistemic belief, which is the domain-specific epistemic belief, and especially the justification thing that we talked about earlier. In this, there are more participants now, but the data that I'm showing is only specific to 37 students, but there is more. So there were 37 students from a wide range, starting from intro to psych to all the way to capstone classes. They participated in this study, and data specific to four participants were removed. Then it's pretty much the same thing, flawed judgment task, um, and the questionnaire, but the questionnaire here is now not the general domain, but the domain specific scientific justification. We also added Nelson-Denny, which is related to reading skill. Again, I'm not going to talk about it. It will deviate us again, followed by recall task. Okay. So the questionnaire, the science-specific questionnaire is something like this. For each item, they have to answer how much they agree or disagree on a 10-point scale. Okay. Now, first thing they did is a flawed judgment task. Second thing they did is epistemic questionnaire. Again, if you remember, these will give us estimates about their beliefs about justification by authority, justification by personal beliefs, of justification by multiple sources. And the same thing here, I'm not going to repeat. We ran that analysis, and of these 13 items fared well. Finally, 3 factors emerged, explaining together 62% of variation in the sample. So I was able to look at the effect of these 3 on how well they evaluated arguments. Okay. I'm not going to talk about this. Again, same recall task, and this is the result. Again, because there are 3 measures or 3 kinds of beliefs, 3 ANCOVAs were run on their flawed judgment score. Then predicate recall skill was also used as a covariate, and this is what is found. There was a main effect of JMS. You can see that here. Those who relied more on justification by multiple sources. Now, the kind of scoring for this particular questionnaire is different from the kind of scoring for the other one. The other one we said lower score is better. Here it's different. It directly gives you a scale in terms of higher they rely on JMS, then the higher the score is. The lower they rely on JMS, lower the score is. Anyway, so as you can see, those who relied more on justification by multiple sources, they actually evaluated arguments much, much, much better than those who relied less on multiple sources. And the opposite was found for the justification by authority, where those who relied more on justification by authority, they actually did worse in terms of evaluating arguments when compared to those who relied low on justification by authority. And it kind of makes sense, right? If you rely more on authority, you may not evaluate arguments better, but most important thing is about multiple sources. So I want to give time for some kind of discussion. So I'm going to stop it here. And in all these experiments, one thing came out, the predicate precision. In all these experiments, those who remembered precisely, they evaluate arguments better. And the effects I talked about in both the experiments are beyond the predicate recall skill.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Dandotkar, for this wonderful presentation. We do have a couple of questions. Dr. Mary-Lise Stoll, she asked, could you give a specific example of a case where a less skilled reasoner is convinced by a bad argument that they repeat certain terms due to over-reliance on semantic cues? Okay,
I don't have that slide here, but I'll actually, I'm sharing my screen, right? So let me pull this. So Marilyn, if you can see this, these 2 items are highly logically related to the claim. The claim is vaccination should be required for all children. And these 2 arguments are highly logically related. These are not related, but low logically related. And within the low logically related, I think you asked to see an example of high semantic content versus low semantic content.
Then we have a question by Dr. Julie Ike. How are epistemic beliefs different than things like lay theories of intelligence, such as, for example, fixed versus growth or learning versus performance goals?
Mhm. I think you can think of these two examples as I'm not an expert on that, but I think you can kind of fit these two examples you gave into the larger picture of beliefs about knowledge and learning in general. For instance, you said the theory of intelligence, that could be a part of one of the beliefs that Schomer introduced in terms of the 5 beliefs related to knowledge and learning in general. Did I answer your question, Julie? So in that sense, they are related, but studied in different domains or by different researchers, but they are connected to some level. But epistemic beliefs is related to knowledge and learning in general, and you can incorporate those examples as well, I think.
Mm-hmm. And then we have another question by Tamara Hunt. So do you have any suggestions for improving student analysis of argument? So I'm assuming, how can students improve their arguments?
Well, there, at least from what we've discussed in so far, one is to what do you say? Ask them to pay attention to the verb, the main point, which they usually miss. Like, what is the main point that you're arguing for? Sometimes we totally forget and get into the nitty gritty, other unrelated stuff. So precision would be one thing. The other thing, I don't know how though, but somehow have some activities that would help them kind of realize themselves that the, I don't know how though, it's more like less simplistic ways of thinking about knowledge and learning or science may not boost them. And one thing we found was like research method classes tend to promote students to kind of think towards changing their beliefs, going from less sophisticated to more sophisticated, not by a lot, but to some extent. So maybe having those courses take into account, and there are other several things, but in general, this is what would come to mind, my mind. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What about in terms of the how students themselves, perhaps without any of our assistance, could improve the argumentation skills? What would your suggestion be for our student and attendees?
Change your major to psychology and take RMS series classes. Sorry. No, I think just you asking that question, if you're a student, shows that you're interested and you'll figure out a way, I guess.
Then we have another question by Dr. Zalomova. Ilfa, how to change students' epistemological beliefs? Okay, so we answered that question, yes. And then we have another question by Caleb Camplain. So one thing I found interesting was the surprise recall portion. Is it really possible to have high verbatim recall and understanding at the same time? Because usually I find that just understanding the main point is more important when studying for the classes and understanding arguments.
I know, Caleb. I think it's the same Caleb from my cognitive class. Yes, so we kind of represent both verbatim, all three, verbatim and text-based meaning and situation model. That's like natural, but we tend to, and we do, which is natural. You're absolutely right. To be able to comprehend more and better, you need to leave the surface form, which naturally happens. But when it comes to arguments, though, there is this opposite thing where you need to retain the surface form representation of a specific element of the argument you're reading, which is counterintuitive, because when you read something, you only take the gist. And when you're reading arguments, though, you need to retain, to an extent at least, you read the argument completely. then maybe you can forget it. Or if you're making a larger argument, then you still need to be able to follow through and keep track of these specifics of the claims. I don't know if I answered that question, but good one, Kill.
Hi, I didn't type this because I'm not exactly sure how to put it, but I sort of wondered, so I'm not at all surprised that students who struggle with thinking logically also believe that they can, learn things really quickly and that they don't have to look at multiple sources. And sometimes I get the impression that it's just because they don't know, right? Like it's just a lack of experience. But sometimes when I'm working with students, I get the impression that they just don't really have the capacity to think about that many different streams of information at once. And so part of why they have that epistemic belief that knowledge formation is simple, that they don't need to look at multiple sources, is because to some extent, they're not fully capable of thinking about how variables connect, about how systems interrelate with one another. Like, so some of it is raw capacity. And I just wonder if there's any research done so far on the relationship between epistemic beliefs and what kinds of capacities people have that allow them to endorse one set of epistemic beliefs over another.
That's a very good question, Marilyn. And there is a paper, actually, I'll send it to you, that looked at exactly this. And it seems like um, and you're bringing in, to some extent, not completely, but the working memory into a discussion. So it is actually found to be related to the epistemic beliefs and evaluation of arguments, more importantly. So working memory does play an important role. And in terms of specifically epistemic beliefs, I don't see any research being done on this topic, but it kind of makes sense that student would lose track of like the things that they need to take into account and just go by the simplistic heuristic of what is available, as opposed to getting into details of multiple things they require. Also, partly I believe it's because, especially when something is new, right, where they don't have a very larger knowledge base, then it's hard for them to do both at the same time. Like develop this knowledge base and also be able to have these more, what do you say, sophisticated beliefs to be able to navigate through all other parts of things that they need to be able to complete a project. Am I making any sense here? So if they go from like, so you'll definitely see some difference in how they maneuver through different aspects, and for a first year student in philosophy versus a final year student in philosophy, because they've already formed some knowledge base and some information is so readily available that they have freed up their space so they can take into account multiple things. But for a first year student, it's if not impossible, at least it's very difficult, because they don't even know what this component means to be able to list it as one of the things you need to get to the final project.
Okay, great, thank you. And then we have another question from Dr. Tamara Hunt. Literary theory proposes that all elements of the text, such as the type, font, the spacing, the size of borders, etc., impact the reader's comprehension. Is this something that your studies have considered?
Yeah, there is a lot of literature on that. I did not personally look into it, but there is a lot. And the interesting thing about these studies that you're referring to, it's not only at the level of the text, font, and things, but also at a bigger level of the formatting of the textbook. For instance, there is a study on bells and whistles, like, would a textbook with more pictures be more helpful than more text, right? And again, what they found was that it depends. And if you are an expert, then a book with pictures would actually distract you. But if you are a novice, then a book with picture would actually enhance your understanding of the material. I haven't looked at it, but there is research on that. That's a good question, Tamara.
Okay,
Yes.
so it seems like maybe then it's coming down to persuasiveness, right? I mean, so when we think about what is most persuasive to people, there's different routes to persuasion, right? So you have the central route for when people are really motivated and able to process, and then you have the peripheral route. And it sort of depends what sort of level of motivation and ability people sort of have to be in those two different routes when they're engaging in the processing of information. And so we know when people are in the central route, they're going to be persuaded by high quality arguments and all of this sort of stuff. And when they're in the peripheral route, they're much more sort of persuaded by surface cues as opposed to high quality arguments. And so I wonder if you've looked into the sort of persuasive literature, and so specifically like the elaboration likelihood model, because it seems like there's a ton of overlap between this type of like who's being most logical, who's not being logical, and maybe with ability, all different sorts of ties in between these two different sort of literatures.
So that's a good question, Julie. So in terms of motivation itself, I think it could be tied to any what do you say? Any field, especially related to educational research. In terms of persuasion, there is literature on persuasion in terms of, I don't know about motivation though, but and I didn't look into it. But there is definitely a difference. There is a lot of literature on the factors that would make an argument more persuasive versus less persuasive, and what are people more persuaded by, and so I think there's a lot on it, but I haven't looked into it. So persuasive literature is so huge and also so varied, because then you have persuasion in the context of general persuasion versus you have persuasion in the context of other specific fields. But I haven't looked into it. But that seems to be an interesting thing. Did I answer or even address your question, Julie?
Yes, yeah. No, that's fine. It just seemed like from what other people were sort of talking about, that it might be an interesting sort of overlap to go into. But yeah. Yep.
We have a comment by Caleb. It's not a question, but Dr. Dandotkar, your cognitive psychology was extremely helpful in preparing him for the capstone.
I'm glad it did. And you did well in my class. Maybe that's why it prepared you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Dandotkar, for such a wonderful presentation and discussion.